When they go in with the mission,
I was wondering if this would work.
Yeah.
Gonna stand here until people begin to feel the office. Good morning. We're gonna get started. We have a faithful few this morning, not that I'm numbering you, taking a census. That is the theme for this morning's class, number the people. So, but I dare not do that. So we're going to be in chapter 24 of 2 Samuel. We have reached the end of 2 Samuel. Raise your hand if you've been here at every single class. I can't raise my hand for that. Sharon? You think you have? It's hard to remember. We started way back in the fall, so we went 2 quarters, so I appreciate you sticking with it. I've really enjoyed teaching this class, and I feel like it's really helped. I know it's helped me understand 2 Samuel the way I hadn't before. Hopefully that's been the same for you. Jack?
Keep George gets more out of it.
Yeah. I believe that's true, yeah, because the time you spend thinking about it, and then you get the comments that people make, and you're right. I think the teacher benefits as much or more than but hopefully you all benefited as well and felt that it's been useful to you. And I think we have a great discussion that we're going to have here in just a second on this chapter as well. So next week, I'll just say this now, it's on your paper as well. Next week, we're going to do, during this time, the Bible Bowl preview. We'll have all the students who have been preparing for Bible Bowl come in, and they will demonstrate their knowledge. So I encourage you to be here and encourage others to come to that as well, because that's helpful to them to feel that they have the support of the church here. And then the following week is when we'll be traveling to Weirton in West Virginia, and that's where the competition will be. So several of us will be gone 2 weeks from now involved in that. So your prayers for those teams would be greatly appreciated, not only for our students, but really all the students involved, that they be blessed by their time there. All right, so we're going to be in 2 Samuel 24, and as you're coming in, there are some papers still back here in the back. Launch one. There are a lot of texts that we're going to look at here at the beginning, and again, the paper has those listed, so if you want to study them in more depth later on this week, you'll want to grab one of those if you don't have them. Keith, will you offer a prayer as we begin?
Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day that you have blessed us with, and we're thankful for this opportunity to open that thy word and receive guidance and strength from it. Father, we pray that we might use the good examples that are given in your word for inspiration, and we realize, Father, that the power is available throughout. Continue to be with our congregation as we continue to learn and grow as Christians. And Father, we pray that we may never take that blessing for granted. Be with those who are not able to be here, those who are weak or those who are ill, those who are struggling. Bless their lives, and may we touch them by our hopes and prayers. These blessings we ask in Jesus' name.
Amen. All right. Dale, can you read for us the first verse? 2 Samuel 24, the first verse only.
Okay. Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah."
All right. So, as I was reading through this, preparing it, I found that it was hard to get past the first verse.
Yeah.
What concerns us? What questions do we have as we read that verse?
God was angry by because of their sin.
Yeah, and we don't know what sin exactly, but God is angry with the children of Israel, we're told. What else? Yeah?
They weren't supposed to really take sense. David took one time on his own and got in trouble with the Lord.
Uh-huh.
The Lord says, take a census. The Lord is instructing him to do it.
He's instructing him to do it. Later on in the chapter, we're going to see David say, I sinned when I did this. So, what are you thinking, Dave?
Well, this chapter is about the consequences of sin.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's not that necessarily sin at this time, but
Yeah, so, and we'll talk about the consequences of sin. So far we've talked around. The other thing that's, to me, is a little troubling here. The actors in this so far are God and David. What does it say that God did? Incited. What does that mean?
that's what I want to say.
That's what you wondered. That's what I wondered.
Well, and then the he is not a capital, like it's not capitalized in my mind. Like it's not God. What does that really mean there? He who he.
Interesting, and that's an interesting thought. That would make it appropriate now to turn to the parallel passage in 1 Chronicles. So hold to your, but go to 1 Chronicles 21, which is, again, a parallel passage. It's kind of like when you have in the Gospels the same story recorded in different Gospels. Here we have the same story recorded both in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. Commentators suggest they were written probably pretty close to around the same time. But there's a little bit different wording with the first verse of chapter 21. Who's got that? Jack, do you have that?
Satan rose up against Israel and decided David to take a census.
Okay, so there, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David. That word incited suggests to me that it's the tempting. And so I'm troubled when I read in 2 Samuel, I don't want to read that God was tempting. And we'll get to some verses about that later on. But we need to understand God's role, Satan's role, David's role, really in all of this. Because it's going to help us also as we think about any time that we are faced with the temptation to sin and what that means. So all we know so far is that God is angry with Israel for something. And who knows? We've seen Israel be rebellious a couple of times as we've read 2 Samuel, so maybe it has to do with something there.
So the he is Satan.
Well, perhaps so, yes, because then you see in 1 Chronicles, Satan is the one who is inciting David, and that is consistent with what we believe, right, about how temptation works. We don't believe that God tempts us. And we'll look at the passage in James that tells us he doesn't, right?
Whereas we talk about consequences, when we sin, we think we get away with it. When we don't.
We think what?
We think we get away with it. It goes away. You
Okay.
sin, but you still suffer the consequences.
Right.
On the line, your family, everybody suffers yours.
Right. And that's a good point, is that, and we're going to see it when we read about the sin and the consequences, because there'll be consequences in this chapter that we're going to read. And it's not just David that feels it, right? So you're right about that. Verse 7 of chapter 21 of 1 Chronicles said, God was displeased with this thing, and he struck Israel. So, Jack made a point about you really weren't supposed to make a census. God was displeased that David did that. Okay. So, but yet God is somehow involved in the fact that it happened. Let's look at some other places in the Bible, some other examples of God's role in people behaving in a sinful way. And see if we can understand it a little better. Probably the classic example that everyone thinks about and sometimes struggles with is that of Pharaoh. So let's go back to Exodus. We'll do a quick little run through of Exodus. Exodus chapter 4 is where we'll start. I think we're all pretty familiar with the whole story of Moses and Pharaoh and the plagues and all of that. And the ultimate goal is for the people of Israel to be freed from Egypt and to be allowed to leave and make their way to the promised land. That is the goal. God is working to redeem his people. In Exodus, I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. All right, so it looks like God is going to act on Pharaoh to prevent him from, at least initially, agreeing to let the people go. All right, that's what it appears is being said in this verse. Now, if you jump over to chapter 7, and again, the Lord is speaking to Moses. This is, I think, after the first encounter, maybe. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you." And then it goes on to talk about, then he says, "I'll lay my hand on you to bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment." You begin to see a little sense of what God is doing here. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is part of the bigger plan. There's a bigger plan there, right? It has to do with judgment against the sinfulness, the evilness of the land of the people of Egypt. And it's also, I think, a revelation to the children of Israel, who have kind of been without much contact with God in the 400 years they were in Egypt, right? So you're seeing a couple of things there in that thinking. In this same chapter, verse 13 says, "Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said." And there you get a sense, so that's Pharaoh himself acting stubbornly, right? Going on, verse 14, the Lord said, "Pharaoh's heart is hardened, he refuses to let the people go." Verse 22, the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. That was the whole thing with causing the water to look like blood, or to be blood. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. He turned and went into his house and did not even take this to heart. So you can see that sometimes the scripture is saying God's doing the hardening. Sometimes you can see it saying Pharaoh is the one making the decision, right? And there's kind of I think we understand as Christians that there's free will in what we do, right?
Just wonder if hardening Pharaoh's heart, God did it by the things he approached Pharaoh with. And Pharaoh hardened them.
That could be, yeah. Putting him in a circumstance in which Pharaoh's choice, which God knew it would be because he knows everything, Pharaoh's choice would be a sinful one.
I think that's what I was thinking of too,
Yeah.
and because he told Moses that he was going to be what to Pharaoh, like a god.
You'd be like God, yeah.
And what man on this earth, like Pharaoh, would want anybody over him?
Right.
He wouldn't want any other man over him. So instantly, right then, he's going to be, no, why should I listen to you?
Just the very fact that Moses stepping in and saying, you got to do this, is leading Pharaoh to dig his heels in and be stubborn and say no.
At least on the miracles, the first two or three, Pharaoh's Egyptians were able to do something similar.
I've always found that to be very interesting that they were. I don't know if that's God allowing them to do that or if they just had some very clever sleight of hand, you know. They made the jumbo jet disappear, you know.
We noticed something interesting when we were recently studying it, that it was fabulous when you read it. It says like in the third plague, maybe or the fourth, it says, and the magicians didn't even try to do that. Like they were not hard-hearted. Like they were like, no, we're just gonna go now.
They got to the point where they recognized, and you can see that.
So
everybody around Pharaoh was beginning to say, you know what, Pharaoh, this is beyond anything we've seen. Yeah, I think you might want to think differently. Yeah.
But, you know, hardened Pharaoh's heart was what happened at the end of it. God made Pharaoh, the Israelite people, such a bother to them that he let them go.
You let them go eventually. Yeah. Yeah, and so you see God working, and you might be inclined to say to yourself, well, maybe it doesn't seem fair. Does Pharaoh not have any choice? But I think what we're saying is he had choices, but God was putting him in circumstances where he would make the wrong choices, even though he had the option to make the right choice. Okay?
There in Exodus 7:14, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding.
Unyielding.
Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. God didn't make it. Pharaoh was stubborn.
His heart was that way in the beginning. Yeah.
Isn't that like us today? I mean, when we do something wrong, God knows it's wrong, but he allows us to do that until we know in our heart that we can't do this.
Right. Yeah, it allows that to happen. Let's go over now to Numbers. Let's look at a different example. I just wanted to look at a couple of things, and these are stories we know that maybe we've sometimes wondered, what's God doing here? I think what we're seeing is God working in a way to accomplish his continuing plan, but in a way that also is challenging to the people involved. Numbers 22 is the story of Balaam. We know Balaam and his donkey, right? The circumstance was that the leader of is it Moab? Oh, Moab and Midian. So Balak, B-A-L-A-K, saw the people of Israel coming through and needed some help. And so he called on Balaam, who was, I think, famous as being one who either had a connection with God or was, I think, divination was maybe the thing that he did. So Balaam was somehow known for being this kind of spiritual guru of some kind, not necessarily of God, but we see that Balaam consults with God, but he's not an Israelite, okay? And then Balak said, hey, Balaam, I want you to come and curse these people that have come. And Balaam has no idea who they are. He said, well, let me consult with God and see if that's okay. And the first time through, God, he consults with him, and God says in verse 12, you shall not go with them, you shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. They are, in fact, God's people of Israel, right? So Balaam tells these people, I'm not going, sorry. God said I couldn't go. They went away, went back to Balak. He said, I'm going to send greater officials, and I'm going to make my offer better. Okay? So he comes back with a better offer, honorable men, it says, and Balaam says, well, let me check with God again. And so he checked with him again, and this time God tells him he could go with him. And that's interesting that he does. He says, if the men have come to call you, this is in verse 20, rise, go with them, but only do what I tell you. So it's interesting. So we see Balaam, he's kind of wishing that God will say yes, because he likes what he sees from the offer that is being given. In fact, at some point, he even says, even if Balak gives me a house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond what the Lord your God, my God, commands. So he's kind of suggesting, if you offer me the silver and gold, So you can kind of see that that's kind of where his heart is going. And God says, okay, but only do what I say. And then it keeps going on, and you know the story of where he's on the donkey, and the donkey sees the angel with the sword in his hand in front of him, and he's trying to kick his donkey and get him back on the road, and the donkey starts talking to him, and he talks back like that's what he does all the time. So it's a fun story. But the point is this. All along, it seems like God is saying to him, it's okay to go. And you wonder, well, what's God doing? Well, what God is doing is he's showing his power through what's going to happen next. Because when he gets there, he's like, and Balak says, okay, go ahead and curse him. And what comes out of Balaam's mouth is nothing but blessing for the people of Israel. 4 times. And I think the 4th time there's even a messianic prophecy in it. So, Balaam is limited, but what God is doing is he's showing his incredible power through all that. So you have an example of Balaam, kind of, I think because of greed, wanting to curse people, but God is not allowing it. So you kind of see what that's happening there. One more example we'll look at is in John 13. These are all things that if you have people who are questioning, well, I don't know if I can believe in this God, they might bring up examples like Pharaoh's hardened heart, or this one here involving Judas. It's always a question of, well, did Judas have a choice? In chapter 13, verse 2, it says, during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And then it goes on to say, Jesus put on the robe, or to put on the towel to wash their feet. So there we see Satan again, right? Remember we saw Satan in 1 Chronicles doing the inciting. Here we see Satan putting it into Judas's heart. That doesn't mean that Judas couldn't have resisted that. He could have. But the thought was there, right? And it says right here at the beginning, that already was in his heart. Okay? And then further down, Jesus talks about the one who's going to betray him, right? In verse 21, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. They were uncertain. They didn't know who it was. They said, who is it? Jesus said, it's he whom I give this morsel of bread when I've dipped it. He dipped the morsel, gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Verse 27, after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, what you are going to do quickly. So there you have Jesus, God on earth, right? We believe Jesus to be deity, commanding Judas to betray him.
Judas, it was his own will to do it. Jesus just telling what you're going to do, you're going to do it. And do it quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how I understand that verse as well. He's saying, if you're going to do it, essentially saying, if you're going to do it quickly. Right?
I think he said, you're going to go to James 1.
I will, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've got James 1 on here too. So what are we seeing? Here's the thing I think that's challenging for us as human beings. We see God acting in these things, and sometimes it appears that he's acting to move someone to do something that's sinful. It appears God is acting that way. But we have to take our whole scripture and understand and remember what we know about who God is, what his nature is, in order to fully comprehend, or at least we won't fully comprehend because we're limited by ourselves, but at least partially understand what God is doing. Okay? We do see Satan involved, and we won't read this one, but in Job chapter 1, you remember the account. Satan comes before God, and God says, well, my servant Job, have you considered him? And you're like, God, don't do that. And if it was Job, you're like, God, keep quiet. But Satan says, well, it's because you bless him. And God says, well, okay, you can do some things, but you are limited, right? He limits Satan. And I think that's what we're seeing is God, for his overall plan, which is a plan of love and mercy and goodness for all of mankind, will act in individual lives and will sometimes remove his hand of protection to allow something to come along that's ultimately for the best for the people involved. It's hard to think about that. You think about Job, you say, was it really for the best? But Job grew through that experience, right?
There was one of those people who follow sin so greatly for such a long time, he gets them over.
They're given over to this sin. 2 Thessalonians is a similar passage in chapter 2 where it says that because the people refused to believe the truth, he gave them over to a lie. Okay? It's always the person, the individual has the free will. And because the person is already inclined to choose against following God, God will sometimes use that as part of his overall plan. Okay? But Satan is always limited, but he's the one we see doing the tempting in the case of Judas and in the case of David in 1 Chronicles. All right, real quickly, let's look at 1 Timothy. And I'm spending all this time because I feel like if we get this point, then everything else in the chapter will kind of fall into place for us. 1 Timothy 2 is a passage that starts out in verse 1 where Paul is giving instructions. I urge you to pray for everybody. Pray for kings, pray for people in high positions, pray all these things. And then in verse 3 he says why. He says, this is good. It's pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So, when we read difficult passages where it looks like God is doing something to harden somebody's heart or whatever, it's important to remember his desire is for everyone to be saved. To have an opportunity, and I believe even Pharaoh had an opportunity if he would choose the right thing. Judas had an opportunity to make the right choice. I think all those things are possible because of what I read here. This also, by the way, is a good verse if you come up against a Calvinist who believes not everybody has opportunity to be saved. They would say, well, what about this? God's desire is for all of us. Right. We won't get into Calvinism right now.
Very similar, I think, verse right here. We should all be comforted.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This isn't the only verse that says that, but that's God's intention. And then James chapter 1 is one that it's always good to remind ourselves because it helps us understand the process. James 1 verse 13 says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. We have within us desires that are sinful. And we get tempted by those desires. And sometimes Satan throws in our path things that move us along that path. But it's always up to us whether or not we accept it. And God is not one to do it.
Well, in the International says he desires it. There's a better word than that. Lust. But each one is tempted by his own lust is dragged away. So we lust after something. That's in our heart.
Yes. And that's a variety of whatever it is. And it can be different for each of us. Although we have some commonality in that we understand those things. Wow.
Well, I guess I like the word, our own evil desires, but we also have, I believe, righteous desires if our spirit is trained by the Holy Spirit.
Right. Yeah, in Galatians where it says keep in step with the Spirit, right? If we are allowing ourselves to be trained by the Holy Spirit, then we will move away from the evil desires. That doesn't mean we'll be perfect, but our goal is to move away from those things.
We can have righteous desires.
And have righteous desires and be more and more like Jesus. That's really why we're still here on this earth, is because our journey from the point of us putting on Jesus in baptism is now to grow to closer and closer to Him. Yeah. Run away from, what is it? Flee sexual immorality, right? Is the phrase. Yes, we need to do that. All right. In 10 minutes, we're going to finish the rest of chapter 24. Let's go back to 2 Samuel now. Hopefully that was beneficial, because to me that helps us put into context what we see here. There's a bigger thing happening, but David has this desire to have the people numbered. He wants to know how many fighting men he has. Now let's read in chapter 24. Turn your paper over. Let's read verses 2 through 10. Have someone read that for us. Who's got that? All right.
So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, go throughout the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and enroll the fighting men, so that I may know how many there are. But Joab replied to the king, may the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my Lord the king see it. But why does the Lord the king want to do such a thing? The king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commanders, so they left in the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. After crossing the Jordan, they camped near Agar, south of the town, within the gorge. And then they went through Gad on the way to Zazar. They went to Gilead and the region of Taharim, Ashby, and on to Dan, Joanne, and around toward Sidon. And then they went toward the fortress of Tyre and all the towns of the Hivites and the Canaanites, and finally they went on to Beersheba in the Negev of Judah. And soon after they had gone through the entire land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah 500,000. So David was conscience-stricken after he counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing.
Okay. All right, so even Joab is concerned when he hears this command. Right? Joab says, my Lord, may the Lord multiply for you 100 times. I think 100 times is it, right? 100 times as many as they are. So even our guy Joab, who we sometimes wonder about choices he makes, is concerned about this. Why is this numbering of the people a sin, do you think?
God already knows the number. And he's speaking for God. It ain't the number anymore. It's God's power. And he's taking away from God's power by thinking about the number.
So he's taken away from God's power by thinking about the number of men. Jack?
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Instead of trusting God, going in the battle, like 300. Get in.
Yeah, numbers don't really matter when God's on your side, right?
God's with us.
Yeah. Yeah.
If he knew the number, then he feels like it was their victory.
You think
Not God.
when you're trusting the number instead of in God's. Yeah.
It's more like a pride.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at all the men I have. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're all on the right track. That it was a pride issue. It was showing not a trust in God, but rather a trust in your own resources. And I think we know that when you're dealing with God, what you have under your own power is not nearly as important as trusting that He can do with whatever you have what should be done. There seems to be, I find it disproportionate that there's 800,000 Israelites and 500,000 men of Judah. But remember, we've had some civil war, right, where the battle involving Absalom and so forth. A lot of people died there. I mean, there've been some things happen, so that may be why. First Chronicles 21, you'll see different numbers there altogether, and you might scratch your head and say, why different numbers? And I think a lot of that is just attributed to the difficulty of interpreting the numbers that were written, like the original text and so forth. Anyway, let's move on from that. Let's read the next section now. Dealing with the aftermath. You get that? The aftermath. All right. So verse 10 we read about it being a sin. David acknowledged it was a sin. Let's read 10 through 17. Who's got that for me? Dale? Okay.
David was conscience-stricken after he encountered the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, O Lord, I beg you to take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad, the prophet, David's seer. Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So Gad went to David and said to him, shall there come upon you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. But do not let me fall into the hands of men. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the time designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord was grieved because of the calamity, and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Arahanan the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family.
All right, so David's given a choice. Which consequence do you want to choose? And he makes his choice. What choice did he make? Number 3, which was the plague, right? And he referred to that as falling into the hand of God rather than into the hands of men. one of the other choices, at least, was the whole the armies pursuing them. Why did he choose the one that he chose?
I think maybe because it only lasts a short time.
Well, it lasts a short time, right?
Because he didn't God was merciful.
Because he knew God would be merciful, right? Men would not be merciful. If his enemies saw that they had an upper hand against David, do you think they would show any mercy? No, they would not. He recognized that of the two, I'd rather be in God's angry hands than I would be in the hands of men, right? And so that says something about God, that even in his anger, he is yet merciful. And we see that here. God is the one who stops the angel, right? Regardless of which punishment he chose, who was going to bear the brunt of the consequences of his sin? It was the people, right? I mean, yes, David felt it, but it was the people that were having all these deaths happen in their families, right? Pretty significant number, 70,000. This, I read a comment that said this was the single greatest plague against Israel as far as number of people that died. So greater than the 24,000 in the wilderness or whatever. There were times when a lot of people died, but this was a pretty big deal. Why do you think that this was an appropriate consequence for the sin of numbering the people? What did it hit?
It significantly reduced his numbers.
Yes, yes. It showed very much why trusting in the numbers is folly. Because right away, I just wiped out 70,000 of those you counted, David. How many more do you want to count? Want to keep going?
Yeah.
So God was showing him again. These numbers are not important.
Do you think some of the people might have been trusting the numbers also?
Yeah.
Could have been.
Not just David was not the only one that's anxious.
I'm sure everybody was hearing about this census. Everybody knew about it, and they probably were like, "Oh, well, we've got a lot of people. We're ready. Bring it on." And then suddenly, like that, and I bet you the 70,000 that died were probably all fighting men. Or the most of them were probably eligible to be soldiers. So it hit directly. All right. I don't know if I think I want to stop us there. The rest of because we're out of time. The rest of the chapter is him securing a place to give a sacrifice. The place is this threshold of this guy, Araunah, I'm not pronouncing it right, who is a Jebusite. Remember, the Jebusites were the ones who possessed Jerusalem before David conquered it. So he's a Jebusite living amongst them. 2 Chronicles 3 tells us that this is the site where they're going to build the temple. All right, so the story has significance for that reason. But David is needing to offer a sacrifice. God is asking him to do that as part of the ending of this plague. All right, so that's where David is required to do something. And it's interesting that he says, Araunah first says, "Hey, I'll just give it to you." And we know that's just a negotiating tactic. But David says, "No, I will not sacrifice something that does not cost me anything." So he offers worship to God, and that's a way of kind of restoring him from his sin. That's the cycle a little bit. Is you get trapped in a sin, you recognize that you've been sinful, you repent, God forgives, and then you offer worship to God. And Psalm 51 has that same kind of pattern in it. So that's what we see here at the end. Any other comments before we end?
I think going back to the first verse, the D we talked about, I think it's safe.
It was stated too. Yeah.
God would tell him to take a census and then punish him.
Yeah. I think what we had there is we had Satan inciting David to take a census. God kind of removes his hand and allows it to happen Because I think what we see is that Satan is always going to be limited by God, right? And sometimes God protects us from those things, and sometimes he withdraws his hand for his own purposes. The end result is David learns a lesson about trust, right?
But in the end, I think it shows his love for God. Doing all those things.
He showed his love for God by coming back and offering sacrifice to him. That's right.
One other thought, we need to be conscious that Satan can still tempt us. He's been thrown out of heaven, it says, Revelation, woe to the earth. Satan has gone down there and looking at times.
Yeah, he's prowling around, isn't he? Like a lion. All right. Thank you all for your comments. Thank you for just being here for this class. Like I said, I really enjoyed doing it, enjoyed being with you all while we do it. Please come back next week for the Bible Bowl preview and encourage the kids as they get ready to go to the competition. Thank you.
All right.